Welcome back to Journey to XRP. And before we go any further, let's kill the fantasy thinking right out of the gate. If banks were already flooding into XRP the way crypto Twitter loves to pretend, this thing would not be sitting around $2 and some change. Period. Markets don't lie just to spare your feelings. Price is information. And right now, the price is telling you something uncomfortable that most people don't want to hear. So picture this for a second. I'm sitting there with a lukewarm latte, half awake, scrolling through X like everyone else does, when a tweet jumps off the screen. Barry C., confident, loud, and absolutely certain, says, "We'll know banks are using XRP when one coin costs as much as a week-long vacation in Bali." He throws out numbers like $100, $500, even $1,000 per XRP. And yeah, that kind of statement grabs you by the collar. When someone slaps a 4-digit price target on a token that's barely holding above coffee money, you've got two choices: laugh and move on, or slow down and actually interrogate the logic. Let's ground this in reality for a moment. XRP is hovering around 220. It had a wild run earlier in the year, tried to push through $3 and got rejected hard. Still, zoom out and you'll see it's up more than 300% year over year. That's not nothing. But there's a canyon-wide gap between $2 and the $100 banks are here threshold people keep parroting. Barry's argument is simple, maybe dangerously simple. If the price is low, banks must not be using it yet. When they do, price explodes. End of story. And I get why that narrative is seductive. Everybody wants to believe they're early. Nobody wants to think they're already late to the party. The replies to that tweet were exactly what you'd expect. Laser eyes, diamond hands, rocket emojis, people swearing they're loading bags before it's too late. That emotional feedback loop is crypto culture in a nutshell. But here's where the cold water comes in. A move from $2 to $100 isn't just bullish, it's a 4,500% gain. $500 is over 22,000%. $1,000 is roughly a 46,000% move. At that point, you're not just talking about a strong asset. You're talking about a market cap that bulldozes past Apple, Microsoft, and starts staring down Bitcoin itself. That's the level where regulators don't tweet, they knock. That's the level where every central bank, Treasury Department, and financial watchdog suddenly has an opinion. This is where most XRP conversations fall apart because people skip the mechanism and jump straight to the outcome. Ripple, the company, has built a powerful product suite. RippleNet handles messaging. On-demand liquidity handles settlement. And here's the key detail most people gloss over. Only ODL actually requires XRP. Everything else can function using fiat rails or stablecoins like RLUSD. In theory, if every major bank wanted the fastest and cheapest cross-border settlement tomorrow, they could use Ripple's software stack and barely touch XRP at all. Banks care about control. They test private ledgers. They experiment with CBDCs. They love predictable environments. They hate volatility, and that matters because it means adoption does not automatically equal price appreciation. Ripple themselves have said it repeatedly, and their software is demand neutral. You can push massive volume through the system and still see the token price barely react if liquidity doesn't run through XRP. And that's not FUD, that's liquidity math. Today, the entire XRP float wouldn't cover a single $1 trillion remittance day. So for the banks are here instant moon theory to work, liquidity has to scale first, not after, before. This is where hype sneaks in. Crypto has always been powered by belief before math catches up, sometimes years before. Bitcoin didn't need perfect fundamentals to go from 3 digits to 5 digits. It needed a story people believed in, and belief moves markets. That's the tension we're dealing with here. Is XRP a slow burn infrastructure asset waiting for its moment, or is it a narrative that keeps getting ahead of its own economics? That's the question we're really answering in this video. And if you're still watching, good, because the uncomfortable truth is just getting started. Here's where the conversation gets more nuanced. And honestly, this is the part most people conveniently ignore because it doesn't fit into a clean moon narrative. Barry's argument hinges on the idea that banks showing up automatically forces XRP higher. But real-world banking doesn't work like a retail pump. Banks don't rush markets. They test them to death. They don't chase volatility. They engineer around it. And that distinction matters more than any tweet ever will. Look at what's actually happening today. Banks that are experimenting with Ripple's ecosystem are doing it quietly in controlled environments. Often with capped exposure, they're testing corridors, settlement speed, compliance layers, and counterparty risk. And when they do move value, they often prefer stable instruments because treasurers are paid to avoid surprises, not chase upside. That's why you see fiat rails, stablecoins, and private ledger experiments getting more immediate traction than a volatile public token. And before anyone gets defensive, this doesn't mean XRP is useless. It means XRP's role is specific, not universal. XRP shines as a bridge asset when liquidity efficiency matters more than price stability. But that use case scales gradually, not explosively. Banks don't flip a switch and suddenly YOLO into a public market. They ramp, they hedge, they throttle exposure. If you're expecting fireworks the moment a logo appears on a press release, you're misunderstanding institutional behavior. Now let's talk competition, because this is another blind spot in the $100 proves banks arrived theory. XRP is not operating in a vacuum. Stablecoins like USDC already have brand recognition, regulatory pathways, and integration across exchanges, wallets, and payment rails. CBDCs are no longer theoretical. Multiple countries are already running pilots or limited rollouts. If you're a conservative global bank, the question isn't, what's the most exciting option? It's, what's the least likely to get me fired? That's why adoption doesn't automatically translate to token demand. A bank can absolutely benefit from Ripple's infrastructure without committing balance sheet risk to XRP. That's not bearish, it's pragmatic. And it's why price can stay boring while the underlying plumbing improves. But here's where the XRP crowd isn't completely wrong either. Efficiency does matter. ODL isn't just marketing fluff. 3-second settlement, minimal fees, and no need to pre-fund Nostro accounts is a real financial advantage. Ripple has estimated savings north of 40% on certain corridors. That's not trivial. If those savings compound across enough volume, eventually decision makers start asking harder questions. At some point, the bridge asset becomes more attractive than the workaround. That's where the optionality of XRP lives. Not in overnight moonshots, but in the possibility that incremental adoption quietly stacks pressure beneath the surface. Markets don't price that kind of setup cleanly. They ignore it until they don't. This is also where narratives step back into the driver's seat. Crypto markets don't wait for balance sheets to be perfect. They front-run stories. We've seen this movie before. Dogecoin reached tens of billions in valuation with no utility roadmap to speak of. Pure belief carried it. If the idea of XRP as the bank token ever fully grips mainstream sentiment, price can disconnect from fundamentals for a long time. That doesn't mean it's guaranteed. It means it's possible. And there's a massive difference between those two words that gets lost on social media every single day. For retail holders, this is where discipline matters. Moon targets are great for engagement, terrible for planning. Treating a single tweet like a financial roadmap is how people round-trip gains or sell bottoms out of frustration. The smarter move is asking what's actually changing under the hood. Ripple's prime broker acquisition, expansion of payment corridors, stablecoin rails, regulatory positioning. None of that screams tomorrow, but all of it screams positioning. And that's the uncomfortable middle ground most people don't want to sit in. XRP isn't dead, and it's not secretly already a 4-digit asset being suppressed by some cartoon villain. It's a complex, slow-moving infrastructure play trying to earn trust in the most regulated industry on Earth. If that frustrates you, good. That tension is the cost of asymmetric opportunity. And it's exactly why the next phase of this conversation matters. Because the real constraints aren't price targets. They're regulation, liquidity mechanics, and human behavior. All right, let's push this forward properly, because this is where most XRP conversations either mature or completely fall apart. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Price is not a scoreboard for adoption in real time. It never has been. Price is a lagging indicator that reacts after narratives, liquidity conditions, and positioning align. Anyone using today's $2 to $3 range as proof that banks aren't interested is thinking like a retail trader, not like capital. Institutions don't announce adoption with price. They announce it with filings, pilot programs, sandbox trials, and boring press releases no one reads. Price comes later, usually violently, and usually after retail has already been shaken out. Now let's talk about liquidity, because this is where the $100 to $1,000 debate either becomes grounded or pure fantasy. XRP's total circulating supply is massive. That's not FUD, that's math. For XRP to sustain triple-digit prices, it needs deep, continuous global liquidity demand, not just episodic volume spikes. One-off bank integrations don't do that. Even a handful of corridors don't do that. What does? Repetition at scale, daily settlement demand, non-speculative flow that must use XRP, not can use XRP, Right now, most of Ripple's enterprise stack is optionality-based, not mandatory. Banks can choose XRP or choose stablecoins or choose internal ledgers. Optionality caps immediate price pressure. That's why adoption can grow quietly while price chops sideways. And this is where people misunderstand the phrase banks are coming. Banks don't come to speculate. Banks come to minimize friction and risk. If XRP becomes the least risky option operationally and not the most profitable, that's when it wins. But here's the part that XRP skeptics consistently underestimate. Once risk is removed, size follows. If regulatory clarity continues, if liquidity tooling improves, if volatility dampens, as market depth grows, XRP slowly transforms from volatile crypto asset into infrastructure liquidity layer. And when that perception flips, capital allocation rules change. That's when the game changes. Now, about Barry C's tweet, let's be honest, it's not a forecast, it's a signal flare. It's saying you'll know adoption is real when price becomes unignorable. That doesn't mean price must hit $100 to validate the thesis. It means price will eventually reflect usage once usage becomes unavoidable. There's also a psychological layer here that most people miss. Retail thinks in price levels. Institutions think in risk-adjusted efficiency. Retail asks, can this go 100x? Institutions ask, does this save us 30-40% annually without regulatory blowback? Those two worlds don't sync on your timeline. And this brings us to why XRP is such a frustrating asset to hold. It doesn't behave like a meme coin. It doesn't behave like a pure DeFi token. It doesn't behave like Bitcoin. It behaves like infrastructure. Infrastructure is boring until it's everywhere. Nobody got excited about TCP/IP. Nobody speculated on HTTPS. Nobody traded Amazon Web Services in its infancy. But once the world depended on them, valuation followed inevitability, not hype. That's the bet XRP holders are actually making, whether they realize it or not. Now let's ground expectations. Could XRP hit $100? Yes, but not because banks flipped a switch. It would require sustained ODL dominance, liquidity constraints from real usage, regulatory normalization, and narrative convergence, institutions plus retail alignment. Could it hit $500,000 only under extraordinary conditions, massive supply lockups, token velocity reduction, macro disruption forcing capital migration, or XRP becoming a default settlement layer across regions? That's not impossible, but it's not a casual outcome. This is why anyone giving dates is guessing. Markets don't move on certainty, they move on surprise. And the biggest surprise usually comes after everyone has given up watching. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with a choice that isn't about price targets at all. You either treat XRP as a long-duration infrastructure option, size it responsibly, and let time do the work, or you trade the volatility, accept the noise, and stop pretending tweets are destiny. What you don't do is anchor your conviction to one influencer, one prediction, or one timeline. That's how portfolios get wrecked. The real edge in XRP isn't secret information. It's patience, positioning, and emotional control. And that sets us up perfectly for the final part. Because now the only question left is how you personally play this, without getting trapped by hopium or shaken out by boredom. Now let's talk about the part almost nobody prepares for. What happens if XRP actually starts moving? Not in fantasy land, but in real markets. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people ignore. Making money is easy. Keeping it is hard. If XRP starts pushing into double digits, the psychological pressure will be brutal. Not because price goes up, but because narratives will get louder, greed will get sharper, and discipline will evaporate. This is where most people lose. At $5, everyone says, this is just the beginning. At $10, people stop sleeping. At $20, timelines turn euphoric. At 30 plus, logic dies completely. And if you don't already know what you'll do before that happens, you will react emotionally, guaranteed. Let's be brutally honest. Most XRP holders have no exit framework. They only have a number someone else tweeted. That's not a plan. That's a liability. Here's the reality. Even if XRP becomes deeply integrated into global finance, price will not move in a straight line. There will be violent pullbacks, profit-taking, and narrative flips. Institutions don't buy tops, and they don't chase candles. They distribute into strength. If you think banks will just keep buying forever, you don't understand markets. Now let's address the supply shock fantasy, because this is where people get sloppy. Yes, ETFs, custody, DeFi locking, treasuries, All of that can reduce circulating supply, but supply shock alone does not create infinite price. It creates volatility. Price only sustains at higher levels if utility demand absorbs that volatility. That means actual settlement volume, consistent corridor usage, reliable liquidity depth. Without those, price spikes are temporary. This is why $100 is hard. This is why $500 is extreme. This is why $1,000 requires a structural rewrite of global liquidity flows, not just adoption headlines. Possible? Yes. Probable in a short time frame? No. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you bullish. It makes you careless. Now let's talk about time compression, because this is where XRP can surprise people. Adoption happens slowly until it doesn't. Financial systems move like glaciers, then suddenly like avalanches. When regulation, infrastructure, and incentives align, change can accelerate faster than anyone expects. That's why dismissing XRP completely is foolish. And that's why betting your entire future on one outcome is also foolish. The smart approach lives in the middle. You don't need XRP to hit $1,000 to win. You need position sizing, patience, and optionality. If XRP fails, you survive. If XRP succeeds, you're exposed. That's how professionals think. One more thing, and this matters. The people screaming loudest about generational wealth are usually the ones who need it the most. That desperation bleeds into decision-making. Markets feed on that. Real conviction is quiet. Real planning happens before the crowd arrives. Real wealth is built by people who can sit through boredom without self-sabotage. So before you ask, is XRP going to $100, $500, $1,000? Ask yourself something more important. What will I do if it goes to 8, 12, 25? If you don't have an answer, price won't save you. So let's land this properly, without hype, without fantasy, and without pretending we know the future. XRP doesn't need to become a 4-digit asset for this to be a winning trade or a winning long-term hold. That idea is seductive, but it's also dangerous because it pushes people into an all-or-nothing mindset. Markets punish that mindset every single cycle. What actually matters is this. XRP sits at the intersection of regulation, infrastructure, and liquidity. 3 things crypto usually doesn't have aligned at the same time. That alone gives it asymmetric upside relative to most tokens. Not infinite upside, not guaranteed upside, asymmetric. If banks truly scale ODL usage, XRP demand increases structurally. If ETFs launch and custody locks supply, volatility increases. If macro liquidity turns risk on again, narratives amplify price. None of those require fairy tales. They require time and execution. Now here's the hard truth most people don't want to hear. If XRP goes to $20, $30, most people will sell too early. If XRP goes to $50, $100, most people will freeze. If XRP ever even approaches $500, almost nobody holding today will still be holding the same size position. Why? Because humans aren't built to sit through life-changing numbers without a plan. And no tweet, no influencer, no OG prediction will carry you through that moment. That's why discipline beats prediction. You don't need to believe in $1,000 XRP. You need to understand why you own it, what invalidates your thesis, and where you take risk off. Everything else is noise. And here's the final reality check. Markets don't reward belief. They reward positioning before belief becomes consensus. If XRP never becomes the backbone of global finance, you adjust and move on. If it does, the opportunity will not announce itself politely. It will move fast, violently, and emotionally. So stop dreaming, start thinking, build a strategy that survives disappointment and success, because both destroy portfolios when people aren't prepared. And as always, this is not financial advice. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. Crypto markets are volatile, nothing is guaranteed, and you should always do your own research and make decisions based on your own financial situation and risk tolerance. If this made you uncomfortable, good. That's usually where clarity starts.